The moment my son looked me in the eyes on Christmas Eve and said, "You're not family anymore," the entire room went silent. I was still holding the small knitted scarf I made for my granddaughter when Ethan pushed the papers across the table toward me. His wife, Vanessa, sat beside him with her arms folded, like she had been waiting for this moment all night. Snow fell softly outside their beautiful Ohio home while I stood there shaking, realizing everyone at that table already knew what was about to happen except me. What hurt the most wasn't the words. It was the way my own son looked relieved after saying them, and that was the moment I finally understood why they really invited me to Christmas dinner. If you're listening tonight, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And honestly, what would you do if your own child looked at you and said, "You're not family anymore"? Don't forget to like and subscribe if stories like this touch your heart. Sometimes sharing these painful moments reminds us we're not alone. My name is Paula Griffin, and until last Christmas, I truly believed I had done everything right as a mother. I'm 67 years old. I live in a quiet little town outside Columbus, Ohio, in the same white two-story house my husband and I bought 40 years ago when interest rates were terrible, and our furniture came mostly from garage sales. The porch still creaks in winter. The kitchen tiles are cracked near the sink. And every spring, the roses Richard planted before he died somehow bloom brighter than the year before. People tell you grief softens with time. That's not true. You simply learn how to carry it without collapsing in public. Richard died 29 years ago during an apartment fire downtown. He was a firefighter for nearly 2 decades. One moment, he was kissing me goodbye in our kitchen with soot already on his jacket. And the next moment, there were police officers standing on my porch asking if they could come inside. Ethan was only 11 years old. That night changed both our lives forever. For a long time after Richard died, Ethan slept in my bed because he was terrified I would disappear too. Some nights I'd wake up and find his little hand gripping my sleeve even in his sleep. I remember staring at the ceiling in the dark, trying not to cry loudly enough for him to hear. I became mother and father overnight, and I worked myself nearly to death trying to make sure Ethan never felt the full weight of what we had lost. During the day, I worked as a school secretary at Jefferson Middle School. At night, I cleaned office buildings downtown with another widow named Carol, who smelled like peppermint gum and cigarette smoke. I would get home close to midnight, sleep 4 hours, then wake up before sunrise to make Ethan pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse because I couldn't afford therapy vacations or expensive gifts. So I gave him love instead. Every ounce of it I had. When Ethan was 13, he overheard me crying over unpaid electric bills in the kitchen. The next morning, I found a wrinkled $20 bill under my coffee mug. It was all the money he had saved mowing lawns that summer. A note sat beside it. For groceries. Love you, Mom. I still keep that note in my dresser drawer. Back then, Ethan had the gentlest heart of any boy I'd ever known. After football practice, he used to stop by the school office just to hug me before riding home with friends. When he graduated high school, he pulled me onto the football field in front of everyone and said, "Everything good in me came from her." I cried so hard, my mascara ran down my neck. When Ethan got accepted into Ohio State, I secretly took a second mortgage on the house to help pay for tuition. I never told him. I didn't want him carrying guilt when he should have been chasing dreams. And he did chase them. After college, Ethan started a small home renovation business with two friends from school. For the first year, the company barely survived. There were months Ethan couldn't pay his workers. Months he sat at my kitchen table, staring at spreadsheets with dark circles under his eyes, while I pretended not to notice how scared he was. I helped quietly. A few $1,000s here, a loan payment there. I even sold the diamond earrings Richard bought me on our 20th anniversary because Ethan needed equipment for a contract that could save the business. I told him I lost them. To this day, he still thinks that story is true. But watching my son succeed felt worth every sacrifice. When his business finally took off, Ethan drove to my house one evening in a brand new truck and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "We made it, Mom," he said. "Not I made it. We." That word meant everything to me. For years, Ethan called me almost every day, sometimes just to ask how long to bake chicken thighs, sometimes to complain about taxes, sometimes for no reason at all except loneliness. Then he met Vanessa Mercer. The first time I saw her, I honestly thought God had answered every prayer I'd ever had for my son. She was beautiful in a polished kind of way, dark, shiny hair, cream colored coat, soft, elegant voice. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays and sent handwritten thank you cards. She worked in corporate event planning and carried herself with effortless confidence. But what impressed me most was how she treated Ethan. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm when he spoke, looked at him like he mattered. After everything Ethan and I had survived together, all I wanted was someone who would love him deeply. And at first, Vanessa seemed to. She called me Miss Paula with this sweet southern charm that made everyone instantly comfortable around her. The first Christmas she spent with us, she helped me bake pies and asked for family recipes. She even cried while looking through old photo albums of Richard. "You raised an incredible man," she told me once. I remember going to bed smiling after that visit. I truly believe my son had found happiness. The changes happened slowly. So slowly, I almost blame myself for noticing them. First, Ethan stopped calling every day, then every few days, then sometimes not for weeks. When I visited, Vanessa always seemed to control the conversation without being obvious about it. If Ethan and I started reminiscing about old memories, she'd interrupt with something practical. "Oh, Ethan, don't forget your meeting Tuesday." Or, "Paula, you already told that story last month." The first time she said that, she smiled while saying it. But something inside me still stung afterward. I started noticing little things. Vanessa corrected Ethan constantly. She chose his clothes, answered questions directed at him, and whenever I disagreed with something, even something small, like how Megan should be disciplined, Vanessa would tilt her head sympathetically and say things like, "Well, sometimes memory changes as we get older." It sounds harmless when I repeat it now, but there was always something underneath her tone that made me feel small, like she was slowly erasing me one careful sentence at a time. The hardest part was watching Ethan change beside her. Not all at once. Not enough for me to point at and say, "There." That's the moment I lost my son. It happened piece by piece, like watching a shoreline disappear during fog. One rainy afternoon about 3 years ago, Ethan came over to fix a leak under my sink. While he worked, I made coffee and asked if he wanted to stay for dinner. He hesitated. That hesitation cut deeper than any argument ever could. "Vanessa already made reservations tonight," he said. And for the first time in my life, my son looked relieved when he left my house. I stood at the front window watching his truck disappear down the street, and an ache settled in my chest that I could not explain. Because mothers know, even before the evidence appears, even before the betrayal fully shows itself. Some part of your heart knows when someone is slowly teaching your child to live without you. What I didn't know then was how far Vanessa was willing to go, or that my husband Richard had seen this possibility long before any of us did. The first time Ethan brought Vanessa to my house, she walked in carrying a peach pie from a bakery downtown and hugged me before I even had time to introduce myself properly. "I've heard so much about you," she said warmly. "Ethan says you're the strongest woman he's ever known." At the time, hearing those words felt like sunlight after years of struggle. I remember thinking how lucky my son was. Vanessa knew exactly how to make people feel special. She asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from previous conversations, sent flowers on Mother's Day with handwritten notes that sounded so sincere, I showed them proudly to my friend Linda. "Maybe your worrying years are finally over," Linda told me one afternoon while we drank tea in my kitchen. And honestly, I believed that too. For the first year of Ethan and Vanessa's relationship, everything seemed almost perfect. They hosted Sunday dinners, invited me to weekend cookouts. Vanessa insisted I sit beside her at Thanksgiving because, as she put it, "You're the heart of this family." Those words still echo bitterly in my mind now. Because people who plan to remove you from a family often begin by studying exactly what you long to hear. The engagement happened on a snowy December night downtown. Ethan called me crying with happiness after Vanessa said yes. I could barely understand him between laughter. She's the one mom, he kept saying. And maybe part of me already knew life was changing faster than my heart could keep up. The wedding itself was beautiful. Vanessa wore a satin dress with tiny pearl buttons down the back, and Ethan looked at her the way Richard used to look at me when we were young, like nothing else in the room existed. During the reception, Ethan gave a speech thanking me for holding our family together through every storm. People cried. I cried hardest of all. Looking back now, I think that was the last day I truly felt secure in my son's life. The changes after marriage didn't arrive like an explosion. They arrived like water dripping slowly into cracks until the entire foundation weakened. At first, it was small things. Vanessa started making decisions before Ethan could answer questions himself. If I asked Ethan whether they wanted to come for dinner, Vanessa would answer for him. Oh, we're probably too busy this week. If Ethan mentioned stopping by my house to help with repairs, Vanessa would gently remind him he needed better work-life boundaries. The strange thing was how reasonable she always sounded. That's what made it so difficult to explain to anyone. There was never one cruel moment I could point to, just hundreds of tiny ones. Tiny cuts, tiny exclusions, tiny humiliations dressed up as concern. One afternoon, I invited them over for lunch after church. I made Ethan's favorite pot roast with mashed potatoes and homemade gravy. He used to beg for that meal as a teenager. When they arrived, Vanessa walked into the kitchen, looked at the food, and laughed lightly. "Oh my goodness," she said. "This is so much butter." I smiled awkwardly. "Well, it's comfort food." Vanessa touched my arm gently. "You know, Paula, people our age really have to watch cholesterol. Our age." She was only 38. I laughed politely because that's what women like me do when we feel insulted but don't want conflict. But Ethan barely touched the meal. That hurt more than I admitted to myself. After lunch, I overheard Vanessa whispering to him in the living room. "She means well, but honestly, your mom lives like it's still 1985. I stood frozen in the hallway, holding dirty dishes, while something cold settled into my stomach. The hardest part wasn't Vanessa herself. It was how Ethan slowly stopped defending me. When he was younger, Ethan would have shut down disrespect instantly. But after marrying Vanessa, he began avoiding disagreement entirely. If she corrected me unfairly, he stayed silent. If she dismissed my opinions, he changed the subject. And over time, silence became agreement. About a year into their marriage, Vanessa started talking more openly about modernizing family responsibilities. At first, I thought she simply meant organizing schedules or helping with Megan after she was born. Then the conversations became stranger. One evening, while we folded baby clothes together, Vanessa casually asked, "Have you ever thought about downsizing your house?" I looked up from a tiny pink sweater. "Not really. It's just such a large property for one person," she said. "And maintenance gets harder at your age." I remember smiling politely again. Always politely. "I'm managing fine." "Oh, of course," she replied quickly. "I just worry about you." That phrase became her weapon. "I worry about you." She used it constantly. When I forgot where I left my glasses, when I repeated a story, when I got tired after driving at night. Each time her concern sounded caring enough that disagreeing almost made me look unreasonable. And somehow Ethan never noticed what she was doing. Or maybe he noticed and simply found it easier not to confront. Then Megan was born. For a little while, my granddaughter brought light back into everything. That little girl had Ethan's smile and Richard's eyes. From the moment she wrapped her tiny fingers around mine in the hospital, I loved her with a fierceness that frightened me. I babysat constantly during Megan's first years, sometimes overnight, sometimes entire weekends. Vanessa used to thank me endlessly for the help. But once Megan started school and Ethan's business became more successful, Vanessa's attitude shifted again. Suddenly, my help became interference. If Megan asked for seconds of dessert at my house, Vanessa accused me of ignoring dietary rules. If I bought Megan gifts, Vanessa said I was teaching materialism. If Megan cried when leaving my house, Vanessa would joke, "Well, Grandma spoils you because she doesn't understand modern parenting." Again, harmless on the surface, cruel underneath. One evening stands out more clearly than the others. It was Megan's 7th birthday party. Ethan and Vanessa had invited dozens of people to a rented event space downtown. Everything looked expensive and perfectly coordinated. Too perfectly coordinated. At one point, Megan climbed into my lap while opening presents and whispered, "Grandma, I like your house better than ours." I laughed softly. Why? Because everybody's nicer there. Before I could respond, Vanessa appeared beside us. "Megan," she said sharply, "don't say rude things." The room went quiet for a second. Megan looked frightened, and instead of comforting his daughter, Ethan frowned at me. "Mom, you shouldn't encourage comments like that." I stared at him in disbelief. Encourage? I hadn't said anything. That was the moment I first realized Vanessa had changed the atmosphere around me so completely that even my silence could be interpreted as wrongdoing. After the party, I sat alone in my car for nearly 20 minutes before driving home. I remember gripping the steering wheel and whispering aloud, "What is happening to my family?" A few weeks later, I got my answer, or at least the first piece of it. I had stopped by Ethan's house unexpectedly to drop off Megan's winter coat. The front door was slightly open, and I heard voices from the kitchen before entering. Vanessa was talking to her mother, Diane Mercer. I almost called out hello. Then I heard my name. "As long as she trusts us," Vanessa said quietly, "everything will eventually become Ethan's anyway." Diane laughed softly. "And if she resists," Vanessa's voice turned colder than I had ever heard before. "She won't. Ethan always does what I tell him." I stood frozen outside that kitchen doorway, unable to breathe properly. Because in that moment, for the very first time, I realized this wasn't simply about family tension. It was about control. And somehow, I had become the target. After overhearing Vanessa and her mother in that kitchen, I drove home in complete silence. Not because I didn't know what to think, because I suddenly had too much to think about. The windshield wipers pushed freezing rain across the glass while my hands shook on the steering wheel. Every memory from the past few years began rearranging itself inside my mind like puzzle pieces finally sliding into place. The comments about my memory, the questions about my finances, the pressure to downsize, none of it had been random. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt older than I had the morning before. I sat in the dark car for several minutes staring at my house. The porch light glowed softly against the snow, and for the first time in 40 years, the home Richard and I built together no longer felt completely safe, because danger looks different when it comes from strangers. You know to lock your doors against strangers, but when it comes wearing your son's face, you don't even recognize it at first. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying Vanessa's words over and over in my head. Ethan always does what I tell him. What frightened me most wasn't the cruelty in her voice. It was the possibility that she was right. Over the next several weeks, I started paying closer attention. And once you truly begin seeing manipulation, you realize how long it's been happening. Ethan stopped answering most of my phone calls unless Vanessa was nearby. When we did talk, his tone felt impatient, distracted, almost rehearsed. One Tuesday morning I called because my furnace had stopped working during a snowstorm. Normally, Ethan would have come immediately. Years earlier, he once drove 40 minutes in the middle of the night just because I mentioned hearing a strange noise outside. But this time, he sighed heavily before I even finished explaining. "Can't you just call somebody, Mom?" The sentence itself wasn't cruel, but the annoyance behind it cut deeply. "I can," I said quietly. "I just thought maybe you'd know someone trustworthy." "I'm busy today," he replied. "Vanessa and I have meetings." Vanessa and I? Not I have meetings. Everything had become we, as though my son no longer existed separately from her at all. Later that evening, Linda Foster came over with soup and extra blankets after hearing about my furnace problem. Linda had been my neighbor for 23 years and possessed the kind of honesty that made some people uncomfortable. She studied my face carefully while stirring sugar into her tea. "What's going on with Ethan?" she asked suddenly. I tried to smile. Nothing. "That's not true." I looked away toward the window. Outside, snow covered the neighborhood in quiet white layers. Christmas lights blinked across nearby rooftops, while my chest felt unbearably heavy. Linda leaned forward. "Paula, I've watched that boy adore you his whole life. Now, every time I see him, he looks tense around you, like he's waiting for you to say something wrong." Her words hit me so hard I nearly cried, because that was exactly how it felt. I finally told her about overhearing Vanessa and Diane. Linda's expression darkened immediately. "I knew something about that woman wasn't right," she muttered. "Maybe I'm overreacting," I whispered weakly. Linda slammed her teacup onto the table harder than intended. "No. Listen to me carefully. Women our age are taught to ignore our instincts so people won't call us bitter or paranoid. But your instincts are screaming right now." I stared down at my hands. The truth was, part of me still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative meant my son was helping destroy my peace piece by piece. A few days later, another strange thing happened. Vanessa called unexpectedly and offered to drive me to a medical appointment. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how many questions she asked during the drive. Had I updated my will recently? Did I still manage all my own finances? Did I ever forget to take medication? At first, the questions sounded casual. Then they became disturbingly specific. "Have you ever considered assisted living communities?" Vanessa asked while stopping at a red light. I turned slowly toward her. "Why would I need assisted living?" "Oh, no reason," she said quickly. "I just think planning ahead is responsible." I felt something cold settle into my stomach again. Later that afternoon, while Vanessa stepped away to take a phone call, I noticed a folder sticking halfway out of her oversized purse. My name was written across the tab. Paula Griffin. I know I shouldn't have looked, but fear makes people do things they normally wouldn't. I carefully opened the folder, just enough to see several brochures for senior living facilities. One brochure already had handwritten notes on it. Memory care wing. My heart started pounding so hard I thought I might faint. When Vanessa returned to the car, I acted like I hadn't seen anything. But from that moment on, I understood something terrifying. They were preparing for a future where I no longer controlled my own life. A week later, Ethan came by the house unexpectedly. For one foolish second, I thought maybe he had come alone to reconnect with me. Then I noticed the tension in his posture, the way he avoided eye contact. He walked around the living room awkwardly before finally sitting at the kitchen table. "Mom," he began carefully, "Vanessa worries about you being alone here." I stayed silent. "She thinks maybe you should consider simplifying things." "There it is," I said softly. Ethan frowned. "What? Simplifying things?" He rubbed his forehead impatiently. "You know what I mean." "No," I replied calmly. "I don't think I do." He exhaled sharply. "The house is too much for you now." I looked around the kitchen Richard built with his own hands. The yellow curtains I sewed myself. The cabinet where Ethan measured his height as a child. The old clock that stopped for 3 days after Richard died, as though grief itself had frozen time. Too much for me, or too valuable for them. I'm managing fine, I said. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You forgot your doctor appointment last month." "I rescheduled it." "You repeated the same story twice at Thanksgiving." I stared at him in disbelief. These weren't his thoughts. They were Vanessa's observations coming out of my son's mouth. "I'm 67, Ethan," I said quietly. "Not 97. You're getting defensive." The conversation suddenly felt unreal, like I was being evaluated instead of spoken to. Then Ethan said something that truly frightened me. You know, if something happened unexpectedly, it would help if I already had legal authority to assist you. Legal authority. The words echoed in my ears. I forced myself to remain calm. Authority over what medical decisions, financial things, emergencies. I looked directly at him. And whose idea was that? For the first time during the conversation, Ethan hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. After he left, I walked upstairs to my bedroom, feeling physically ill. I opened Richard's old cedar chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out the folder he instructed me never to discuss unless absolutely necessary. Inside were trust documents, legal protections, letters written in Richard's handwriting. At the time he created them, I thought he was simply being cautious because of his dangerous job. Now I wondered if my husband understood human nature far better than I ever had. Tucked between the papers was one handwritten note addressed to me. If anyone ever tries to make you feel powerless, remember this family was built by your strength first. I burst into tears reading those words, because for the first time in months, someone's voice reminded me who I used to be before fear entered my own home through the people I loved most. And deep down, I finally accepted the truth. This wasn't going to stop on its own. 3 weeks before Christmas, Ethan called me for the first time in nearly 10 days. The moment I heard his voice, my heart reacted before my mind could protect me. Because no matter how old your child becomes, some part of you still responds to them the way you did when they were small and frightened and calling for you in the dark. "Hey, Mom," he said warmly. Warmly. That alone should have warned me. Ethan hadn't sounded warm toward me in months. I stood in my kitchen, gripping the phone tighter, while snow drifted softly beyond the window above the sink. "Hi, sweetheart. We've been talking," he said. "And Vanessa and I thought maybe we should all have Christmas together this year, like old times." For one dangerous moment, hope rushed through me so fast, it almost hurt physically. Like old times. I closed my eyes. Images flashed through my mind instantly. Richard carving turkey at the dining table, Ethan tearing open presents in footy pajamas, cinnamon candles glowing beside the fireplace, while Bing Crosby played softly in the background. I had spent months feeling like a ghost, haunting the edges of my own family. And suddenly, my son sounded like himself again, or at least enough like himself to fool me. "That sounds nice," I said carefully. "We want it to be special," Ethan continued, "especially for Megan." At the mention of my granddaughter, my resistance weakened even more. I missed Megan terribly. Vanessa had slowly reduced my visits over the previous year. First by claiming Megan's schedule was too busy, then dance classes, then school events, then family weekends. Eventually, I realized I was seeing my granddaughter only when Vanessa allowed it. Grandma Megan whispered sadly during our last visit months earlier, "Why don't you come over anymore?" I nearly cried right there in front of her, because children always notice distance before adults admit it exists. "What time should I come?" I asked Ethan. There was a brief pause. "Oh, and Mom Vanessa was hoping maybe you could bring some paperwork with you." Immediately, every muscle in my body tightened. What kind of paperwork? You know, house stuff, tax information, insurance documents, things like that. My voice stayed calm, though my pulse had begun racing. Why another pause? "For family planning," he said finally. "Just practical conversations. Family planning." That phrase sounded polished, prepared, rehearsed. Still, I forced myself to answer lightly. "I'll see what I can find." "Great," Ethan said quickly, sounding relieved. "Vanessa says it'll help us all stay organized long term. Us all. Again." Everything had become we and us, while I increasingly felt like an outsider orbiting their decisions. After we hung up, I remained standing motionless in the kitchen. The house suddenly felt very quiet. Too quiet. I looked down at the phone in my hand and heard Richard's voice in my memory. "If something feels wrong, don't ignore it just because you want peace." That night, I barely touched dinner. Instead, I pulled all the financial documents Vanessa requested from my filing cabinet and spread them across the dining table. House deed, insurance policies, bank summaries, investment information. Looking at everything together made me realize how vulnerable older people truly become. Not physically, legally. One signature at the wrong moment could destroy a lifetime of stability. The next morning, I called Linda. "You're bringing absolutely none of those originals," she said immediately after hearing the situation. "I probably won't even need them," I replied weakly. "Paula." Her tone sharpened. "Stop making excuses for people who are making plans around you instead of with you." I sat quietly. Linda sighed. "Have you talked to an attorney?" The truth was, I hadn't wanted to, because involving lawyers would make everything feel real, and I still desperately wanted this to be misunderstanding instead of betrayal. But later that afternoon, I found myself sitting in a small downtown law office across from a woman named Susan Keller. She was in her early 60s, with silver blonde hair cut sharply at the jawline and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. After listening carefully to my concerns, she folded her hands on the desk. "Mrs. Griffin," she said gently, "have they ever directly pressured you to transfer assets?" "Not exactly. But they've discussed your memory, independence, future, care, yes." Susan nodded slowly. "And your son is asking for property documentation before Christmas dinner." Hearing it summarized aloud made the situation sound far uglier than I'd wanted to admit. I looked down at my lap. "I know this sounds paranoid." "No," Susan said firmly. "It sounds familiar." I looked up sharply. She leaned back slightly. "Financial exploitation of older adults often begins gradually. Family members introduce the idea that you're struggling. Then they create dependency. Then they position themselves as decision makers." A chill spread through my chest. Susan continued carefully. "I'm not saying your son intends harm, but I am saying you should be extremely cautious." I swallowed hard. What should I do? Do not sign anything? I wouldn't. You'd be surprised how many intelligent people sign documents under emotional pressure during family gatherings. Christmas dinner. Suddenly, I understood why they wanted the conversation there. Because refusing strangers is easy. Refusing your child in front of your granddaughter is much harder. Susan asked several more questions before finally saying something that unsettled me deeply. "Has anyone suggested memory problems formally?" "Doctors, evaluations, not officially. But informally, I thought about Vanessa's constant comments, the careful observations, the concern disguised as kindness." "Yes," I whispered. Susan's expression hardened slightly. "Then you need to protect yourself immediately." Before I left, she handed me her business card. "Call me if anything feels wrong at Christmas. Something feels wrong." The problem was everything already did. A few days later, I stopped by Ethan's house unexpectedly to drop off gifts for Megan. Vanessa opened the door, wearing cream-colored cashmere and a smile so polished it looked painful. "Paula, you should have called first. I was nearby." "That's fine," she replied quickly. "We're just very busy lately." I handed Megan's wrapped presents to her. Vanessa barely glanced at them before setting them aside. Then her eyes drifted toward the envelope in my hand, containing photocopies of tax forms I'd been reviewing earlier. "Oh, good," she said casually. "You found the paperwork." There was something eager in her voice she couldn't fully hide. "I'm still organizing everything," I replied carefully. Vanessa stepped closer. "You know Ethan worries because you handle all this alone." Interesting, because Ethan himself had never once expressed concern until Vanessa entered our lives. "I've managed for decades," I said softly. Vanessa smiled sympathetically. "Of course, but things change as we age." Again, always the same implication. I looked past her into the house and saw Ethan sitting at the kitchen island staring down at his phone. He barely acknowledged me. For a brief moment, sadness overwhelmed fear. Because manipulation doesn't only destroy the victim, it destroys the person being manipulated too. That night, after I returned home, I made a decision that changed everything. I opened my bedside drawer and removed the small digital recorder Susan suggested I carry. Then I tested it twice. Not because I wanted evidence against my own family, but because somewhere deep inside me, a terrible instinct had already begun whispering the truth. Christmas dinner wasn't going to heal my family. It was going to expose it. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in silence and snow. I remember standing in my bedroom for nearly 20 minutes, trying to decide which sweater to wear, which sounds ridiculous considering what was about to happen. But women like me were raised to believe appearances could hold families together. That if you looked calm enough, smiled warmly enough, cooked enough casseroles, and avoided enough conflict, love would survive anything. I chose a dark green sweater Richard used to love on me and a pair of pearl earrings I hadn't worn in years. Before leaving the house, I stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting my scarf, while anxiety curled through my stomach like smoke. Then I slipped the digital recorder into my purse, just in case. The roads were icy as I drove to Ethan's neighborhood. Christmas lights glowed across rooftops, and for a few painful moments, I let myself pretend this evening might still end peacefully. Maybe I was wrong? Maybe everyone had simply become stressed. Maybe families survived rough seasons all the time. But the second I walked through Ethan's front door, I knew none of those comforting lies were true. The atmosphere felt wrong immediately. Too formal. Too controlled. Vanessa greeted me with a stiff smile and an air kiss near my cheek that never actually touched skin. Paula, you made it. Not, we're happy you're here. Not Merry Christmas. Just acknowledgement. Behind her, the house looked immaculate in a way that almost didn't feel lived in. The dining table was decorated with expensive gold candles and crystal glasses, every napkin folded perfectly, every chair positioned precisely, like a staged photograph instead of a family gathering. Then I saw Diane Mercer sitting in the living room beside her husband Harold. Diane wore an icy white pantsuit and the expression of someone arriving for a business negotiation rather than Christmas dinner. Paula, she said coolly, still driving yourself around in this weather, I forced a polite smile. So far, yes. Diane exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa. A tiny glance, but I noticed it. Megan came running into the room before anyone else could speak. Grandma. She threw her arms around my waist so tightly, my eyes instantly burned with tears. There's my girl, I whispered. For a moment, holding her against me, I almost felt normal again. Then Vanessa stepped forward immediately. Megan, sweetheart, let Grandma sit down first. Don't overwhelm her. Overwhelm me, as though I were fragile, as though affection from my granddaughter might somehow confuse me. I slowly removed my coat while Ethan finally emerged from the kitchen. The sight of my son nearly broke my heart. He looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. His smile seemed forced, and dark shadows rested beneath his eyes. Merry Christmas, Mom, he said quietly. I searched his face for warmth, for guilt, for anything that might tell me my son was still somewhere beneath all this tension. But he barely held eye contact. Dinner itself felt like walking through a storm while pretending the sky was clear. Every conversation carried hidden edges. Diane repeatedly brought up aging. Memory gets tricky. After 65? She remarked casually while buttering bread. Vanessa nodded sympathetically. That's why planning ahead matters so much. Harold mostly stayed silent, eating slowly, while avoiding my eyes entirely. Only Megan behaved naturally. She showed me drawings from school and whispered funny observations about classmates, while Vanessa kept correcting her table manners every few minutes. At one point, Megan reached for another dinner roll. Vanessa immediately frowned. You've had enough bread tonight? Megan lowered her hand silently. Without thinking, I slid half my own roll onto Megan's plate. Vanessa's expression tightened instantly. She doesn't need encouragement with unhealthy habits. The entire table went quiet. I looked directly at Vanessa. She's 9 years old. Vanessa gave a soft laugh. Exactly. Habits start young. I turned toward Ethan, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he simply stared down at his plate. That silence hurt more than open cruelty ever could. After dinner, Vanessa insisted everyone move into the living room for coffee and dessert. The moment I saw the large manila folder sitting on the coffee table, my chest tightened. Here it comes. Vanessa sat beside Ethan, while Diane leaned forward eagerly in her chair. The entire setup suddenly felt rehearsed, like everyone had assigned positions beforehand. Vanessa smiled carefully. Paula, we've all been talking because we care about you so much. There it was again. Concern. Always concern. I folded my hands tightly in my lap. I see. Ethan cleared his throat nervously. Mom, this is just about making sure everything is secure for the future. Vanessa opened the folder smoothly. Inside were several legal documents already prepared. My pulse began pounding. One document involved property transfer authority, another granted financial access, and another, God help me, was partial medical power of attorney paperwork. I looked slowly from page to page while the room watched me. Not with love, with expectation. We're not asking for anything unreasonable, Diane said. At your age, these protections are smart. At my age, I repeated quietly. Vanessa leaned forward with practiced gentleness. Paula, nobody's questioning your independence. We just think it's important to prepare before things decline unexpectedly. Things decline. I suddenly realized they had likely discussed me this way privately for months, maybe years, like a problem to manage. Not a mother, not a grandmother, a liability. I set the papers down carefully. I'm not signing these. The shift in the room happened instantly, like warmth disappearing from a fireplace. Diane's pleasant expression vanished first. Why not? Because I don't want to. Vanessa sighed softly as though dealing with a difficult child. This is exactly what worries us. You become defensive anytime someone tries helping. Helping? I almost laughed from disbelief. Ethan rubbed his forehead impatiently. Mom, nobody's trying to take anything from you. Then why are transfer documents already prepared? No one answered immediately. That silence told me more than words could. Then Vanessa delivered the sentence that made my blood run cold. We even consulted a specialist about future care options. Future care. A specialist. I stared at her. You consulted someone about me. Her tone remained calm. Only because we love you. I looked toward Ethan desperately. You knew about this. He shifted uncomfortably. We're trying to avoid a crisis later. A crisis. My voice cracked. I'm healthy. Diane crossed her legs sharply. For now. The cruelty of those two words hit me like ice water. Megan looked frightened now, glancing between adults without understanding what was happening. Mom, Ethan said more firmly, now you're making this harder than it needs to be. I looked at my son, the little boy who once slipped grocery money under my coffee mug because he hated seeing me struggle, and suddenly I barely recognized him. Then Vanessa reached into the folder one final time. We also have documentation from a physician willing to evaluate cognitive concerns if necessary. The room tilted. Cognitive concerns. There it was. The real plan finally standing naked in front of me. Not help. Control. And for the first time that night, fear transformed into something colder. Something steadier. Because I realized they had already decided who I was supposed to become. Weak. Confused. Dependent. Easy to remove. What they didn't realize yet was that I had walked into that room prepared. The moment Vanessa mentioned cognitive concerns, something inside me changed permanently. Not shattered, not weakened, hardened. For months, I had doubted myself, second-guessed my instincts, wondered whether loneliness and age had made me overly sensitive. But now the truth sat openly on the coffee table between us in black ink and legal language. They weren't trying to help me. They were building a case against me. I looked down at the documents again while my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Property transfer authorization, financial access, medical decision authority. Every paper moved power away from me and toward Ethan and Vanessa. Always Vanessa. The room felt suffocatingly warm, despite the snowstorm outside. The Christmas tree lights blinked softly beside the fireplace, like some cruel parody of family warmth. Across the room, Megan sat curled quietly in an armchair, clutching the scarf I'd knitted for her earlier that month. Her wide eyes moved nervously between the adults. She knew something was wrong. Children always know. Paula Vanessa said carefully, using that fake soothing voice again, "Nobody wants conflict tonight." Conflict. Interesting word, as though I had created this situation simply by refusing to surrender control of my life. I lifted my eyes slowly toward Ethan. "Did you know all these papers would be waiting for me tonight?" He hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. "Mom, did you know?" His jaw tightened. "Yes." The word hit me harder than I expected. Because deep down, even after everything, some small, pathetic part of me had still hoped my son was being manipulated without understanding the full situation. But he knew. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every cruelty, but enough. Enough to sit me down on Christmas Eve like a business transaction. I nodded slowly. "I see." Diane leaned forward impatiently. "Paula, honestly, you're taking this far too personally." Too personally. I almost laughed, as though losing ownership of my own home and independence should feel casual. Vanessa placed one manicured hand gently on Ethan's arm. "We're simply trying to avoid future complications." "No," I said quietly. "You're trying to control my future before I'm even incapable of managing it myself." The silence after those words stretched sharply across the room. Then Ethan suddenly stood up. His chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "Why are you making us the enemy?" he snapped. I stared at him in shock. Making us the enemy? I looked around the room at the prepared documents, the rehearsed explanations, the physician references, the pressure disguised as concern. Then I looked back at my son. "When exactly did you all decide I was no longer capable of making decisions for myself?" Ethan rubbed both hands over his face aggressively. "Jesus. Mom, this is exactly what Vanessa warned me about." There it was again. Vanessa warned me. Vanessa thinks. Vanessa worries. My son no longer sounded like an individual human being. He sounded like an extension of her voice. "I'm 67 years old," I said carefully. "I pay my own bills. I maintain my home. I drive myself. I volunteer twice a week. What exactly have I done to make you think I need supervision?" Vanessa answered before Ethan could. "It's not one event. It's patterns." Patterns. Such a calculated word. "What patterns?" I asked. "You repeat stories. Everyone repeats stories. You become emotional easily." I stared at her in disbelief. "My husband died." Vanessa inhaled dramatically, like someone trying desperately to remain patient with a difficult person. "Paula, please don't twist this." That sentence nearly took my breath away. "Because manipulative people always accuse you of doing exactly what they're doing to you." I turned toward Ethan again. "You really believe this?" He avoided my eyes. "We just think it's time to be realistic." Realistic. The word echoed hollowly through my chest. Then Diane spoke with blunt irritation. "You should be grateful your son is willing to take responsibility for you." Responsibility, not love, not support. Responsibility. Something cold and sharp settled fully into place inside me then. I realized these people no longer saw me as Paula, not as Richard's widow, not as Ethan's mother, not as Megan's grandmother. I had become an aging asset they intended to manage. And suddenly, strangely, I stopped feeling afraid. Because once you clearly see someone's intentions, confusion disappears. Only choices remain. I carefully placed the documents back onto the coffee table. "I'm not signing anything." Vanessa's composure cracked first. Her smile vanished completely. "Paula, refusing to plan ahead only proves our concerns are valid." "No," I replied calmly. "Refusing manipulation proves I'm still capable of protecting myself." Ethan exhaled sharply. Why are you being so stubborn? Stubborn. I spent decades sacrificing for that boy. Worked double shifts, sold jewelry, went without vacations, skipped meals some months after Richard died so Ethan could play football and attend school trips. And now protecting my own home was stubborn. I looked directly at him. Do you know how many times I saved you financially over the years? He frowned immediately. What you heard me, Vanessa quickly interrupted. This isn't about old sacrifices. Of course, she didn't want that conversation happening, because people like Vanessa survive by rewriting history. I stood slowly from the couch. My knees trembled not from weakness, but heartbreak. I think I should leave. Then everything exploded. No, Diane snapped suddenly. We are finishing this tonight. The authority in her voice stunned even Ethan. Vanessa rose quickly, too. Paula, please sit down. I said I'm leaving. Ethan's frustration finally boiled over. You can't keep acting like a victim every time someone challenges you. Victim. The word struck me like a slap. Megan began crying softly across the room. Dad, stop. But Ethan was too angry now. Years of manipulation, pressure, financial stress, and buried resentment were pouring out of him all at once. You know what the problem is? He shouted. You think everything should stay exactly the same forever. I stared at him silently. That house is too much for you. It's my house. You don't even understand how hard everyone's trying to help you. Help me. The insanity of the moment almost felt unreal. Then I quietly asked the question that had been breaking my heart for months. When did you stop seeing me as your mother? The room froze. Even Vanessa looked startled for a second. Ethan's face hardened instantly. And then he said the sentence that would replay in my nightmares for months afterward. You're not family anymore. Silence. Complete silence. Even the Christmas music playing softly from the kitchen suddenly seemed distant. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I looked at my son, the little boy who once cried because he thought I worked too hard. The teenager who promised he'd always protect me. The man whose entire life I had helped build. And I realized he truly meant what he'd just said. Not from temporary anger. Not fully, but enough. Enough for the words to leave his mouth without hesitation. Megan burst into tears. Daddy Vanessa immediately pulled her close while glaring at me as though I had caused the scene myself. I felt strangely numb, like my body understood the pain was too large to process all at once. So instead, everything inside me simply went quiet. I picked up my purse slowly. No one stopped me this time, not even Ethan. At the front door, I paused briefly and looked back at the room. At the papers, at Vanessa's cold eyes, at Diane's impatience, at my son standing there breathing heavily, like he'd finally said something buried deep inside him. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. This wasn't the first conversation they'd had about removing me from my own life. It was simply the first one I had been invited to hear. Outside, snow fell heavily across the driveway as freezing wind hit my face. My hands shook violently while I climbed into the car. Then, before starting the engine, I reached into my purse and pressed play on the recorder. Every word, every threat, every manipulation, every lie disguised as concern. I had all of it. For the first time that night, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not because I felt powerless, but because I finally understood that if I didn't protect myself now, no one else would. I barely remember the drive home after Christmas dinner. Snow blurred across the windshield, while tears kept clouding my vision faster than the wipers could clear the glass. Several times I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too badly to steer. You're not family anymore. No matter how many years a woman lives there, are some sentences her heart never prepares to hear, especially from the child she built her entire life around. When I finally reached home, the house felt unbearably empty. I stood in the foyer, still wearing my coat, listening to silence settle around me like dust. No Christmas music, no laughter, no Richard sitting in his recliner, pretending not to cry during holiday movies. Just me. Alone. I should have felt broken. Instead, beneath the grief, something else had begun growing quietly inside me. Clarity. Because pain strips illusions away faster than anything else in this world. And for the first time in years, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. They had shown me exactly who they were. I walked slowly upstairs to my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside sat the thick leather folder Richard instructed me to protect no matter what happened after his death. Back then, I thought he was simply being cautious because firefighting had taught him to prepare for emergencies. Now I understood he had been preparing for something else entirely. Human weakness, human greed, human manipulation. I carried the folder downstairs and spread the contents across the dining room table while snow continued falling outside the windows. Trust documents, investment records, property protections, letters, so many letters. Richard always communicated best through writing. Even during our marriage, he used to leave notes in strange places for me to find, later inside recipe books, coat pockets, kitchen drawers. After he died, those notes became sacred to me. And that Christmas night, I read every single one again. One letter in particular stopped me cold. It had been written only 3 months before Richard's death. If you're reading this years from now, there's a chance Ethan has grown into a good man. I pray he has. But love can make people vulnerable to the wrong influences. Promise me something. Paula, never surrender your independence just because someone makes you feel guilty for having it. I covered my mouth as tears slid down my face, because Richard had seen something in the world I never fully allowed myself to see. Some people mistake kindness for weakness, and family members often feel more entitled to your sacrifices than strangers ever would. For the next 2 hours, I reviewed documents carefully. The truth was staggering. Richard's trust had protected far more than I realized. After his death settlement and pension investments matured over decades, the trust quietly became substantial, far more substantial than Ethan knew. And over the years, I had used portions of those funds repeatedly to save my son. Not lavishly, strategically. When Ethan's business nearly collapsed during its second year, I anonymously covered equipment financing through a holding account Susan Keller helped establish years earlier. When Ethan and Vanessa bought their oversized suburban home, I secretly paid off a six-figure tax issue, threatening their mortgage approval. Even Megan's private elementary school tuition had been partially funded by distributions from Richard's trust. Ethan believed his business success came entirely from his own hard work. And yes, he worked hard. But every time disaster approached invisible hands, my hands quietly steadied the fall before he even realized danger existed. I sat back slowly in my chair, staring at the paperwork. Then a horrible realization settled over me. Maybe Ethan had slowly stopped respecting sacrifice because he never fully saw it. Everything painful I did for him happened silently. I protected him from struggle so thoroughly that he began assuming stability simply existed naturally. Like electricity in a wall. Turn a switch and it appears. No gratitude necessary. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table. Ethan. For one weak moment, hope flared painfully inside me. Maybe he regretted it already. Maybe he'd realized what he'd said. I answered immediately. Mom. But the tone in his voice crushed hope instantly. Not regret? Stress? Frustration? Vanessa's really upset, he said. I closed my eyes slowly. Of course she was. Not because they hurt me, because I refused to cooperate. She thinks tonight got out of hand. Out of hand. Like the evening had simply become emotionally messy rather than deliberately cruel. You told me I wasn't family anymore, I replied quietly. Silence stretched briefly. Then Ethan sighed heavily. You know I didn't mean it like that. But I did know. That was the problem. I think you should give everyone a few days to calm down, he continued. Then maybe we can revisit the paperwork more rationally. Revisit the paperwork. Not apologize. Not repair the relationship. The paperwork still mattered more. Something inside me finally went cold. No, I said calmly. Another silence. What do you mean? No, I mean there will be no paperwork discussion. Mom, I'm done discussing control over my life. His tone sharpened immediately. You're being emotional again. There it was. The language Vanessa taught him. Every feeling I expressed had become evidence against me. I'm hanging up now, I said quietly. Mom, don't do this. Too late. He already had. I ended the call and stared at the dark phone screen for a long time. Then I made the hardest decision of my life. The next morning, I contacted the financial administrator managing Richard's trust. By the end of that conversation, several automatic support transfers connected to Ethan's business accounts had been suspended indefinitely. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, just like I had always helped him quietly. I sat in my kitchen afterward, trembling from guilt, because even after everything, part of me still wanted to protect my son from consequences. That's the curse of motherhood. Love doesn't shut off simply because someone wounds you, but another voice inside me, the voice growing stronger since Christmas Eve, finally whispered something I needed desperately to hear. Saving someone from consequences can destroy them worse than consequences ever will. Over the following week, I began noticing subtle changes immediately. Ethan called twice, asking strangely indirect financial questions. Had I recently changed any banking arrangements? Was I still comfortable helping with Megan's tuition schedule? Did I know anything about delayed business transfers? I answered vaguely. For the first time in years, uncertainty had entered his life instead of mine. Meanwhile, I met Susan Keller again and gave her copies of the Christmas recording. She listened carefully from beginning to end without interrupting once. When it finished, her face looked grim. "This is worse than I expected," she said quietly. Hearing an attorney say that made my stomach twist. Susan organized the documents neatly. The repeated references to cognitive decline concerned me most. They were establishing a narrative. A narrative. Exactly. Not one emotional holiday fight. A coordinated storyline. "You believe they intended legal intervention?" I asked softly. Susan chose her next words carefully. "I believe certain people around your son were preparing to argue diminished capacity, eventually, yes." I looked down at my trembling hands. My own family, my own son. Susan's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Griffin, predators don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they look familiar." That sentence haunted me for days afterward, because she was right. The greatest danger in my life had not arrived through strangers or criminals. It arrived through the people who sat beside me at Christmas dinner, pretending to love me while discussing how to take control of everything I built. And for the first time since Richard died, I finally understood something important. No one was coming to rescue me. Not Ethan, not time, not guilt. If I wanted peace, dignity, and independence, I was going to have to defend them myself. By the second week of January, the silence between Ethan and me had become something heavy and unnatural. No morning phone calls, no pictures of Megan, no casual conversations about weather or football or grocery prices, just silence. The kind that settles over a relationship after something unforgivable has been spoken aloud. Still, I noticed something else beneath that silence. Pressure. At first, it appeared in small ways. Ethan suddenly texted, asking whether I had reconsidered the paperwork discussion. Vanessa emailed me articles about healthy aging transitions. Diane Mercer mailed brochures from luxury retirement communities directly to my house without even asking permission. Each gesture carried the same message underneath: "We are still trying to move you." But something inside me had changed since Christmas Eve. For years, I reacted emotionally, hoping love would soften people. Now I watch carefully instead, quietly, strategically. And the more carefully I watched, the more frightened I became by how organized their behavior actually was. One icy Tuesday morning, I met Susan Keller again downtown. This time, I brought everything: the recording, the trust documents, the emails Vanessa had sent, even handwritten notes I'd taken after suspicious conversations. Susan spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the material, while I sat across from her twisting tissues nervously in my lap. Finally, she removed her glasses slowly. "Paula," she said carefully, "you were right to come here." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. "How bad is it?" Susan folded her hands together. "In my professional opinion, there are clear signs of attempted coercive financial control." Hearing the situation described in legal language made it feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. "They're my family," I whispered weakly. Susan nodded sadly. "In most elder exploitation cases, they usually are." The word exploitation made me physically flinch, because victims imagine criminals as strangers, not daughters-in-law serving wine beside Christmas trees, not sons they once rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. Susan continued gently. "The references to memory issues concern me most. They appear to be establishing a pattern that could later support competency challenges." Competency challenges. I stared at her blankly. "You mean they could try declaring me mentally unfit if things escalated far enough?" "Yes." The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead. "But I'm healthy." "I know that," Susan replied firmly. "And legally, your rights remain completely intact. But manipulation often works through repetition. If enough people begin repeating the same narrative, it can influence family members, physicians, even courts in some situations." Narrative. Again, that word. I realized Vanessa hadn't merely been insulting me over the years. She had been constructing a story about me. Forgetful, emotional, dependent, aging. Every tiny comment served a larger purpose. I suddenly remembered dozens of moments differently. The constant corrections, the concern, the subtle humiliations in front of others. It had never been random. Susan opened a folder beside her. "There's something else you should know." Her expression sharpened slightly. "I did some preliminary background research on Vanessa Mercer." I looked up immediately. "What did you find?" "She was indirectly involved in a property dispute involving an elderly aunt about 8 years ago." A cold chill spread through my body. "What kind of dispute?" "The aunt accused Vanessa and another relative of pressuring her to alter estate documents after cognitive decline concerns were raised." My stomach turned. "What happened?" "The case never reached court. The aunt passed away before proceedings advanced. For several seconds, I couldn't speak, because suddenly Christmas Eve no longer felt like some isolated family disaster. It felt practiced, experienced." Susan watched my face carefully. "I'm not saying Vanessa is criminal," she added cautiously, "but I am saying the behavioral patterns are concerning." Behavioral patterns. The same phrase Vanessa loved using about me. I let out a shaky breath. "What do I do now?" Susan leaned forward slightly. "You protect yourself immediately. Over the next hour, we began changing nearly everything connected to my financial and legal protections. Updated estate directives, revised medical authorizations, restricted access protocols, emergency legal instructions if competency challenges were ever attempted." Each signature felt surreal. I never imagined spending my retirement years legally defending myself from my own child. At one point, Susan paused while reviewing paperwork. "Paula, have you considered that Ethan may not fully understand the extent of what Vanessa is doing?" The question hurt more than I expected, because part of me still desperately wanted that to be true. "I don't know anymore," I admitted softly. And that was the truth. I honestly no longer knew where manipulation ended and Ethan's own choices began. When I returned home that afternoon, Linda was waiting on my porch holding coffee and cinnamon rolls. The moment she saw my face, she frowned. "That bad?" I nodded silently. Inside the kitchen, I told her everything Susan had discovered. Linda listened without interrupting once. Then, she said something I never forgot. "Paula, some people don't steal all at once. They slowly convince you to hand things over willingly while making you feel guilty for hesitating." Exactly. That was it. Not force. Conditioning. For years, Vanessa had been training everyone around her to see me differently, less capable, less relevant, less necessary, and somehow I had allowed myself to shrink under it. Not anymore. Over the following days, I slowly began reclaiming parts of myself I didn't realize I'd surrendered. I started attending community events again instead of isolating at home. Returned to volunteering at the library twice a week. Had lunch with old friends without apologizing for existing. Even small things felt strangely rebellious now. One afternoon while grocery shopping, I caught my reflection in a freezer door and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked old, because she looked afraid. That realization broke my heart more than Ethan's words ever could. I had spent so long trying not to upset other people that I stopped protecting my own peace entirely. That night, I made another difficult decision. I changed my will, not out of revenge, out of necessity. Susan helped establish a protected charitable structure connected to elder advocacy organizations Richard once supported quietly during his firefighting years. For the first time in months, making those arrangements gave me something unexpected: relief. Not because I wanted to punish Ethan, but because I no longer wanted my entire life reduced to an object people fought over. A few days later, Ethan finally showed up at my house unexpectedly. The moment I opened the door, I noticed the tension immediately. His shoulders were stiff, his eyes tired, and for the first time in years, he looked financially frightened. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside silently. He sat at the kitchen table while snow drifted outside, exactly the way it had the night Richard used to help Ethan with homework there. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan finally cleared his throat. "Some payments connected to the business got disrupted." I said nothing. "We're trying to figure out what happened." Still silence. Ethan rubbed his hands together anxiously. "Mom, did you change something financially?" There it was. Not concern about our relationship, not remorse. Money. I looked at him carefully. For the first time in my life, I saw my son not as the little boy I raised, but as a grown man standing at the edge of consequences he never expected to face. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. Ethan had become so accustomed to invisible rescue that he genuinely believed stability belonged to him automatically. He had no idea how often I protected him from collapse. "No," I answered calmly. It wasn't technically a lie. I hadn't changed something. I had simply stopped saving him. Ethan studied my face uneasily. Then his voice lowered. "Vanessa thinks you're angry enough to retaliate." Retaliate? Interesting word. As though protecting myself from exploitation counted as cruelty. I folded my hands quietly on the table. "Ethan," I said softly, "your wife spent years teaching you to question my sanity instead of questioning her intentions." His face tightened immediately. "You're twisting things again." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm finally seeing them clearly." For a brief second, uncertainty flickered across his expression. Just a second. But it was there. And deep inside, I realized something important. For the very first time, the story Vanessa created about me was beginning to crack. By February, Ethan's life had begun unraveling faster than even I expected. And the terrible truth was, I took no pleasure in watching it happen. People imagine emotional justice feels satisfying. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it feels like watching someone you love slowly drown after spending years secretly holding their head above water. The first sign came through silence again. Ethan stopped pretending everything was fine. When he visited my house 2 weeks after asking about the disrupted business payments, his exhaustion looked worse. His clothes were wrinkled, his beard untrimmed. The confidence he once carried so naturally seemed to have disappeared completely. Meanwhile, Vanessa had become openly hostile. Not toward me directly at first, toward Ethan. I learned that accidentally through Megan. My granddaughter called me late one evening while crying quietly. "Grandma." The moment I heard her voice trembling, my heart dropped. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Mom and Dad are fighting again." I closed my eyes. In the background, muffled shouting echoed through the phone. Adult voices. Sharp, angry, the kind children remember forever. Megan, I said gently, where are you right now? In my room? Okay, stay there for me, sweetheart. Her voice lowered into a whisper. Dad keeps saying he doesn't understand where the money went. Money. Again. Always money. Not love, not peace, not family. The stability underneath their entire marriage had apparently been tied together by invisible financial support Ethan never even knew existed. And now that support was gone. I spoke softly until Megan calmed down enough to sleep. After hanging up, I sat alone in my kitchen for nearly an hour staring at nothing. Because despite everything Vanessa had done, hearing my granddaughter frightened inside her own home still broke something inside me. A few days later, Ethan arrived unexpectedly again. This time he looked desperate. He stood in my doorway, holding a folder of papers so tightly his knuckles were pale. Mom, he said immediately, I need to ask you something. I stepped aside silently. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cinnamon bread I'd baked that morning, but Ethan barely noticed. He spread invoices, bank notices, and loan documents across the table with shaking hands. There's something wrong with the business accounts. I sat quietly. Several vendor payments bounced. He swallowed hard, and the emergency reserve line disappeared. Of course it disappeared, because for years I had quietly replenished it whenever things became unstable. But Ethan never knew that. To him, it probably looked like the universe itself had suddenly turned against him. I don't understand, he muttered. We were stable. No, you were supported. There's a difference. He looked up at me finally. You really don't know anything about this. I met his eyes calmly. I know your business has depended on help for years. Confusion crossed his face immediately. What help? I almost told him everything right then. About the trust, the payments, the tax debt I erased without recognition. But something stopped me. Because if Ethan learned the truth too early, he might focus only on recovering the financial support instead of confronting the deeper betrayal underneath everything. And for the first time in his adult life, my son needed consequences more than rescue. Before I could answer further, Ethan's phone buzzed loudly across the table. Vanessa. His entire expression tightened before he even answered. That's not fair. He snapped immediately after picking up. Silence. Then, I said I'm handling it. More silence. I looked away politely while he paced near the sink. Finally, his voice rose sharply. Well, maybe if you stop blaming everybody else for 5 minutes. The call disconnected suddenly. Ethan stood motionless, gripping the phone. I had never seen him look so defeated. She's under a lot of stress, he muttered weakly. Interesting. Even now, he defended her automatically. What exactly is Vanessa stressed about? I asked quietly. Ethan laughed bitterly. Everything. He sank heavily into the chair across from me. The mortgage is behind. That startled me more than I expected. How behind? He rubbed both hands over his face. 2 months, 2 months. That house, the beautiful oversized house Vanessa insisted they buy in the expensive subdivision, had always been beyond Ethan's real comfort zone financially. I knew that from the beginning. That's why I quietly helped stabilize things whenever cash flow dipped. Without those hidden protections, the illusion collapsed frighteningly fast. And, Vanessa, I asked carefully. Ethan stared at the table. She thinks somebody sabotaged us. Sabotaged. I almost smiled sadly. No, Vanessa. You simply removed the person holding everything together. She keeps saying. This started after Christmas, Ethan continued quietly. Of course she noticed the timing. Manipulative people always track resources carefully. Then Ethan said something that made my stomach tighten. She thinks you're punishing us. I looked at him steadily. Do you? He didn't answer immediately. That silence mattered, because for the first time since all this began, Ethan no longer sounded certain. Later that week, Linda called after seeing Ethan's truck parked outside my house again. He looked terrible, she said bluntly. He is terrible. No, Linda corrected sharply. He feels terrible. That's different. I stayed quiet. Linda sighed softly. Paula, sometimes people only understand the value of peace after they destroy it. The next major crack appeared publicly. Ethan's company lost a renovation contract he desperately needed because one supplier refused further credit extensions. Word spread quickly in our small Ohio business community. And suddenly, Ethan, the successful self-made contractor everyone admired, began looking unstable. Meanwhile, Vanessa's behavior worsened dramatically. Megan started calling me more often. Tiny, frightened conversations. Mom says Dad ruined everything. Dad slept on the couch again. Mom keeps yelling about bills. One evening, Megan whispered something that chilled me completely. Grandma, Mom said you owe us? Us. The entitlement in that single word nearly took my breath away. Not owe Dad, not owe family, owe us, as though my entire existence existed to finance their comfort indefinitely. That same night, Ethan showed up again unexpectedly during a snowstorm. This time he looked furious. Not at me, at life, at himself, at something he still didn't fully understand. She admitted it, he said the moment I opened the door. I frowned. Who admitted what, Vanessa? Snow clung to his coat while he paced my living room like a trapped animal. She said she never wanted financial stress like this. Said she married me, believing I was stable. I felt my chest tighten painfully. Ethan laughed bitterly. She actually said, I didn't sign up to struggle. There it was. The truth finally surfacing through the cracks. Not love, security, lifestyle, image. I watched my son carefully. For years, Vanessa controlled the emotional climate around him completely. Now financial pressure was exposing parts of her personality even he could no longer ignore. What did you say? I asked quietly. Ethan stopped pacing. I asked what she meant. His voice lowered into something wounded and ashamed. She said she's tired of carrying everyone. Everyone. Interesting choice of words for a woman who had contributed far less than she believed. Then Ethan looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Confusion, real confusion. Mom, he said slowly, why does it suddenly feel like everything in my life was balancing on something invisible? Because it was. And for the first time, I think part of him finally sensed it. Not the money specifically, the protection, the unseen safety net, the quiet force that had always softened his failures before they became disasters. Me. I looked at my son standing in the middle of the house Richard and I built together, and suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. Ethan had spent so many years believing adulthood meant independence that he never noticed how much of his life still rested quietly in his mother's hands, until those hands finally let go. The truth finally began surfacing in March. Not dramatically at first, not with screaming confessions or shocking revelations. Truth usually arrives quietly, like water seeping through walls before the entire structure finally collapses. By then, Ethan looked like a completely different man from the confident business owner he had been a year earlier. He had lost weight. The constant tension around his eyes made him appear older. Even his posture had changed somehow, as though disappointment itself had physical weight. And Vanessa had stopped pretending entirely. The sweetness was gone now. No more polished concern. No more gentle explanations about planning ahead. Pressure exposes people eventually, and financial pressure had stripped away every mask she wore. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Ethan called me unexpectedly. His voice sounded strange, flat. Mom, he said quietly, can I come over? I immediately knew something serious had happened. When he arrived 30 minutes later, he looked pale and shaken in a way I had never seen before. He didn't even remove his coat at first, just stood in my kitchen, gripping his phone tightly. What's wrong? I asked carefully. For several seconds, Ethan couldn't answer. Then he finally looked up at me with eyes full of something I recognized immediately. Fear. I found emails, he whispered. My chest tightened. What kind of emails? He laughed once, bitterly, the kind that make you realize your entire marriage might have been built on lies. I stayed silent while Ethan slowly sat down across from me at the kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against the windows while he unlocked his phone with trembling hands. I wasn't snooping, he said quickly, almost defensively. Vanessa left her laptop open this morning before taking Megan to school. Something in his expression told me he already wished he'd never looked. Then he turned the screen toward me. An email chain. Between Vanessa and Diane, I began reading silently. At first, the messages sounded practical. Discussions about finances, about Ethan's business instability, about long-term planning. Then the tone changed. Diane, Paula is becoming more emotional. That helps our case later. I felt cold instantly. Ethan stared at the table while I continued reading. Vanessa, Ethan still hesitates sometimes, but he's getting used to the idea that she can't manage things forever. Another message. If we can get authority before the trust details change, everything becomes much easier. Trust details. My heart skipped. They knew? Not everything, but enough. Another email mentioned assisted living facilities. Another referenced isolating Paula from outside influence. Outside influence, meaning Linda, meaning Susan Keller, meaning anyone who might protect me. Then I found the message that finally shattered Ethan completely. Vanessa. Once the house is transferred, we can sell it later and solve most of our problems. She doesn't need that much space anyway. Sell it. My home. The house Richard built with his own hands. The kitchen where Ethan learned multiplication. The staircase where he sat crying after his first heartbreak at 16. To Vanessa, it was never a family home. It was inventory. I slowly lowered the phone. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan whispered, "She planned all of this, not we." She. The distinction mattered, but not enough. Because although Vanessa created the manipulation, Ethan had still participated in it. "You knew about the paperwork," I said quietly. He flinched immediately. "I know. You allowed them to question my sanity." His eyes filled instantly with shame. "I know." The silence between us felt unbearably heavy. Then Ethan covered his face with both hands. I thought she was protecting us. Us. Still that word. But now it sounded broken. Not powerful, not united, just frightened. She kept saying, "You were slipping mentally," he whispered. "And every time you got emotional or upset, she pointed to it like proof." Exactly. That's how manipulation works. It creates wounds, then uses your reaction to the wounds as evidence something is wrong with you. I sat quietly while Ethan struggled to process everything. Then he said something that nearly broke my heart completely. She already talked to a nursing facility. I froze. What he looked physically sick now. She contacted them months ago asking about memory care waiting lists. Months ago. Before Christmas, before the papers, before the confrontation. This had been planned long before I realized danger existed. Ethan's breathing became uneven. She said she was just researching options because she cared about you. Cared about me? The phrase sounded grotesque now. Then Ethan looked up suddenly. There's more. He unlocked another email. This one made my stomach turn completely. Diane. If Paula becomes isolated enough emotionally, she'll eventually sign anything to keep the family close. I stared at the words silently, because that was exactly what they had been doing. Withholding affection, distance, coldness. Not randomly, strategically. They were starving me emotionally while positioning themselves as my only path back to connection. A tactic. Not family conflict. A tactic. Ethan's voice cracked suddenly. Oh, God. I looked up. Tears stood openly in my son's eyes now. Not performative tears, not manipulative tears. Real ones. She used me. The sentence came out almost like a child speaking. And for one dangerous second, my instincts as a mother surged forward, wanting to comfort him immediately. But pain stopped me. because no matter how manipulated Ethan had been, I still remembered standing in that living room, hearing my own son say I wasn't family anymore. Manipulation explains behavior. It doesn't erase responsibility. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered suddenly. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was, the apology I'd been waiting months to hear. But strangely, it didn't heal anything immediately, because some wounds need more than words. "You believed her?" I said quietly. He nodded weakly. She made everything sound logical. Every concern, every suggestion, every criticism. His voice shook harder. "And every time I defended you, she'd say I was being emotionally manipulated by guilt." I almost laughed bitterly. Interesting. Vanessa accused me of emotional manipulation while systematically manipulating everyone herself. Classic. Then Ethan whispered something even more devastating. She said Dad would have wanted practical decisions. Richard. She used Richard too. That hurt more deeply than I can explain, because Richard spent his entire life protecting people, and Vanessa twisted his memory into justification for controlling me. Suddenly, Ethan stood abruptly and began pacing my kitchen. I ruined everything. Part of me wanted to deny it, but honesty mattered now. "Yes," I said softly. "You did." He stopped moving instantly. The truth hit harder because I didn't scream it. I simply said it calmly. Then Ethan looked at me with complete devastation. How do I fix this? I had no answer. Because some relationships don't return to what they were before betrayal. Not completely. Not ever. At that exact moment, another car pulled into my driveway. We both looked out the window. Vanessa. Even from inside the house, I could feel the fury radiating off her as she slammed the car door and marched toward the porch. Ethan's face drained of color. She tracked my phone. The front door burst open seconds later. Vanessa entered like a storm. For the first time since I met her years earlier, she made no attempt to appear charming. Her eyes immediately locked onto Ethan. "You took my laptop." Ethan stared at her silently. Vanessa's gaze shifted toward me. And suddenly, I saw it fully. No mask, no sweetness, only rage. "You had no right," she snapped at Ethan. "No right," he repeated in disbelief. "You planned my mother's institutionalization." Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. She needed structure. Structure. Not love, not support. Structure. Ethan actually recoiled slightly at her tone, like he was hearing her clearly for the first time. "You talked about selling Mom's house?" Vanessa rolled her eyes impatiently. "Because none of this would even be happening if she stopped clinging to the past." The contempt in her voice stunned even me. Then Ethan asked the question that finally destroyed whatever remained between them. "Did you ever actually love me?" Silence. Just 1 second of silence, but that second told him everything. Vanessa looked away first. And in that moment, my son's entire world collapsed right in front of me. The family meeting happened 3 weeks later. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was tired of secrets, tired of whispers, tired of manipulation hiding behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. Susan Keller advised me to handle everything formally clearly and with witnesses present. By then, Ethan and Vanessa were barely speaking, except to argue about finances, legal exposure, and Megan's custody schedule if separation became necessary. The marriage was collapsing rapidly, and somewhere beneath all the chaos, my son was finally beginning to understand what it feels like when trust dies slowly inside your own home. I agreed to the meeting for one reason only. I needed the truth spoken aloud where no one could twist it anymore. That Saturday afternoon, snow melted slowly outside, while gray clouds hung low over Ohio. I sat in my living room, waiting beside Susan, whose organized folders rested neatly across the coffee table. The same coffee table where Richard and I once played cards on Friday nights. Life changes strangely. One decade you're building memories, the next, you're defending yourself from the people who inherited them. Ethan arrived first. The moment he walked inside, I noticed how different he looked now. Smaller somehow. Not physically, but emotionally. The confidence Vanessa once amplified in him had collapsed completely. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. I nodded politely. No hug, no warmth, not cruelty, just distance. Consequences create distance before healing ever begins. A few minutes later, Vanessa arrived with Diane and Harold Mercer. Vanessa wore another elegant cream-colored coat, but the polished perfection she once carried so naturally was cracking now. Tension sharpened every movement she made. Diane still looked defiant. Harold looked ashamed. Interesting difference. No one spoke much at first. Susan finally broke the silence professionally. "Thank you all for coming." Mrs. Griffin requested this meeting to clarify several serious matters involving financial pressure competency concerns and attempted coercive control. Vanessa immediately scoffed. "That's an absurd exaggeration." Susan calmly opened one of the folders. "Then I'm sure you won't object to reviewing the evidence together." Evidence. The word shifted the energy in the room immediately. Because manipulative people survive best in emotional confusion. Facts threaten them. I sat quietly while Susan arranged printed emails beside transcripts from the Christmas recording. Ethan stared at the papers like they physically hurt to look at. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "This is ridiculous." Susan ignored her and looked toward me gently. "Paula, would you like to begin?" My throat tightened suddenly. For a moment, I saw flashes of all the Christmas mornings Ethan and I survived together after Richard died. Cheap gifts, burnt cinnamon rolls, laughter despite grief. I never imagined my life would lead here. But I straightened my shoulders anyway. Yes. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. I spent years believing I was imagining things. That maybe I was too emotional or too sensitive. I looked directly at Vanessa. But eventually, I realized I wasn't becoming confused. I was being trained to doubt myself. Vanessa rolled her eyes immediately. "Oh, please." Susan slid a document across the table. One of the emails. The room fell silent while Diane read it. If Paula becomes isolated enough emotionally, she'll eventually sign anything to keep the family close. No one spoke, because some sentences expose everything by themselves. Ethan lowered his head slowly into his hands. Vanessa immediately snapped, "You're taking that out of context." "Then explain the context," Susan replied calmly. Vanessa hesitated, just briefly, but enough. Manipulation collapses quickly under direct questions. Diane suddenly jumped in angrily. "We were trying to help Paula is getting older whether she likes it or not." I looked directly at her. "Getting older does not erase my rights." Diane's face hardened. "No one said it did. You prepared legal authority documents before even discussing concerns with me honestly." Vanessa leaned forward sharply. "Because every conversation with you became emotional," I almost laughed. Of course I became emotional. They were discussing removing control over my life. Susan calmly pressed another button on the recorder beside her. And suddenly, the room filled with sound. Christmas Eve. Voices. My voice. Vanessa's voice. Then Ethan's. "You're not family anymore." The words echoed through the living room with horrifying clarity. No one moved. No one breathed. Even hearing it again felt like reopening a wound. Across the room, Ethan visibly flinched at the sound of his own voice. Megan, who had quietly entered halfway through the meeting with Harold after dance practice, froze completely near the doorway. "Daddy," she whispered softly. The devastation on Ethan's face at hearing his daughter react to those words nearly broke me. But truth matters, especially ugly truth. Vanessa suddenly stood up. "This is emotional theater." "No," I said quietly. "This is accountability." Her eyes snapped toward me immediately. For years I would have shrunk under that look. Not anymore. "You questioned my sanity," I continued steadily. "You researched nursing facilities without my knowledge. You attempted to pressure me into surrendering legal authority over my finances and home." Vanessa scoffed again. "You make it sound criminal." Susan answered before I could. "In some circumstances, courts might view elements of this behavior very seriously. That finally rattled Vanessa visibly. Good. For once, someone else felt unstable instead of me. Then Ethan suddenly spoke. Quietly at first. She told me you were slipping mentally. Everyone looked at him. Ethan stared at the floor while speaking. She kept pointing out every repeated story, every emotional reaction, every forgotten detail. His voice cracked slightly. And eventually, I stopped trusting my own judgment. I closed my eyes briefly, because that confession hurt almost as much as the original betrayal. Not trusting his own judgment meant Ethan eventually stopped trusting me too. Vanessa looked furious now. Oh my God. Ethan, stop acting like some helpless victim. Victim. Interesting. She hated vulnerability unless she controlled it. Then Harold Mercer finally spoke for the first time all afternoon. Quietly. I told Diane this was going too far. Everyone turned toward him in shock. Diane's face drained immediately. Harold, no, he interrupted softly. Enough. He looked toward me with deep shame in his eyes. I should have stopped this earlier. The room fell silent again. Then Harold said the sentence that shattered the last illusion completely. Vanessa and Diane talked about the house constantly. Vanessa stood abruptly. You don't know what you're talking about. Yes, I do, Harold replied sadly. I heard you. Diane exploded immediately. Oh, now suddenly everyone's innocent except us. Megan started crying quietly near the hallway. Ethan turned toward his daughter instantly, and for the first time in months, I saw pure horror cross his face, because suddenly he understood something terrible. His child was watching all of this, just like he once watched me suffer after Richard died. Children absorb pain silently, then carry it for decades. Ethan knelt beside Megan immediately. I'm sorry, he whispered, but I honestly don't know whether he meant it for the Christmas words or for everything. Vanessa looked around the room, realizing control was slipping away completely. Then her voice turned cold. Fine, she snapped. Yes, I wanted stability. Yes, I wanted security. Because unlike all of you, I actually think about survival. Survival. Such an interesting justification for greed. I looked at her calmly. You already had a family. She laughed bitterly. No, Ethan had a family. I inherited obligations. That sentence ended everything. Even Ethan looked physically wounded hearing it, because suddenly every loving moment of their marriage became questionable. Every smile, every reassurance, every promise, all contaminated by doubt. Susan quietly closed her folder. There's one final matter. She slid updated trust documents across the table. Paula Griffin has revised all estate and access protections effective immediately. Vanessa's eyes widened instantly while scanning the papers. Then came the final blow. Neither Ethan Griffin nor Vanessa Griffin will receive administrative control or direct access to the protected trust assets. Complete silence. Vanessa looked absolutely stunned, because for the first time since entering my life, she realized something important. She had lost, not just financially, emotionally, strategically, completely. I looked at my son then, not with hatred, not even anger anymore, just sadness. Because life had finally taught Ethan the lesson I spent years trying to protect him from the moment you allow someone to destroy your conscience. They eventually destroy your peace, too. After the family meeting, everything fell apart faster than anyone expected, especially for Ethan. For weeks afterward, I barely heard from him. Not because he was angry anymore. Anger would have been easier to understand. No. What consumed my son now was something heavier. Shame. Real shame changes people quietly. It drains the color from their voice, makes them avoid mirrors, makes ordinary memories suddenly painful. And Ethan had finally begun remembering everything clearly. Meanwhile, Vanessa moved through the collapse, like someone trying desperately to escape a sinking ship before anyone blamed her for the holes. 3 days after the meeting, she moved into a luxury apartment downtown with Megan temporarily staying part-time between them. The separation became public almost immediately in our small community. Neighbors whispered. Business contacts pulled away. Even church friends started behaving awkwardly around Ethan. Not because divorce shocked them, because the Christmas recording had quietly spread farther than anyone intended. I never released it publicly, but families talk, friends talk, and eventually truths that spend too long hidden always find daylight. One afternoon, Linda came over carrying grocery bags and gossip I honestly didn't want to hear. People are saying Vanessa tried to push you into assisted living for your money. I sighed tiredly. People should mind their business, Linda snorted. They didn't mind their business when they were treating you like the problem. Fair point. Still, I took no joy in Ethan's humiliation. Despite everything, he was still my son, and mothers are strange creatures. Even after betrayal, some instinct inside us continues searching for signs our children can still come home emotionally. But Ethan wasn't ready to come home yet. First Life had more lessons waiting for him. By April, his business was in serious trouble. Without the hidden financial cushioning I had quietly provided for years, every mistake now had real consequences. Vendor debts accumulated. A pending renovation lawsuit resurfaced. Two employees quit unexpectedly after delayed paychecks. And worst of all, Ethan finally realized how much of his lifestyle had been supported by invisible rescue he never acknowledged. One evening, he showed up at my house looking exhausted beyond words. Dark circles hollowed beneath his eyes, rain soaked through his jacket. For several seconds after I opened the door, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan looked around the familiar hallway quietly and whispered, "I used to feel safe here." That sentence almost broke me, because I knew exactly what he meant. This house once represented unconditional love to him, a place where failure didn't destroy belonging. I stepped aside silently. He walked into the kitchen slowly, almost like a man visiting a childhood museum. Everything looked the same. The old clock, the faded curtains, Richard's framed firefighter photo above the dining table. But Ethan looked at it differently now. Consequences change the way people see ordinary things. "I found out about the taxes," he said quietly after sitting down. I froze slightly. "How, my accountant?" He gave a weak, bitter laugh. "The emergency payments that saved us years ago weren't anonymous enough." Silence filled the kitchen. Ethan stared at his hands. "You paid off the business debt." Not a question. A realization. I said nothing. His eyes filled slowly with tears. "And the mortgage issue?" "When Vanessa and I bought the house," again I stayed silent, because the truth no longer needed explanation. It only needed acknowledgement. Ethan covered his face briefly. Oh God. I watched my son crumble under the weight of understanding piece by piece. Not because he learned I helped him financially, because he realized he built resentment toward the very person secretly protecting him all along. "I told you that you weren't family anymore," he whispered hoarsely. Hearing him repeat the words himself sounded almost unbearable. Then he looked up at me with complete devastation. "And you were still saving me." I finally spoke softly. "That's what mothers do." He started crying then, not dramatically, quietly, like a grown man discovering too late how deeply loved he had always been. For several minutes, neither of us moved. Rain tapped gently against the windows, while Ethan sat at my kitchen table crying into trembling hands. And suddenly, all I could see was the 11-year-old boy who lost his father and tried so hard to become strong too quickly. Pain doesn't disappear when children grow up. It simply changes shape. "I don't know who I became," Ethan whispered finally. I thought carefully before answering. "You became someone who stopped questioning the person beside you because it was easier than questioning yourself." He nodded weakly. "That's true." Then he admitted something else. "Part of me liked believing you needed me." That honesty surprised me. Ethan stared at the table shamefully. Vanessa kept saying I was finally becoming the man of the family. The decision maker? The protector. His voice cracked again. "And somehow I started confusing control with responsibility." Exactly. That was the heart of it. Vanessa didn't merely manipulate Ethan financially. She manipulated his identity, made him feel powerful by slowly reducing me. That realization haunted him deeply now. A week later, the divorce discussions officially began. Vanessa moved aggressively, demanding assets, demanding protection, demanding financial guarantees Ethan no longer had. According to Megan, the arguments became vicious. Mom says Dad ruined our future, she whispered sadly during one phone call. Children should never carry sentences like that. One Saturday morning, Ethan arrived again unexpectedly, but this time he brought a cardboard box. Inside were old photographs, family albums, childhood drawings, Richard's old baseball glove. I found these in the attic, he said quietly. We spent hours sorting through memories together in silence. Sometimes grief reconnects people more honestly than conversation can. At one point, Ethan picked up a photograph of himself around age 12, standing beside me at a school fundraiser. I looked exhausted in the picture. He looked proud. You worked 2 jobs, then he said softly. Yes. And I never knew. You weren't supposed to. He stared at the photograph for a very long time, then whispered something I will never forget. You spent your whole life protecting me from pain, and I repaid you by believing people who wanted to use you. The honesty in his voice hurt more than excuses ever could, because now Ethan finally understood the full weight of what he had done. Not one cruel sentence, not one terrible Christmas. Years. Years of allowing manipulation to reshape the way he saw his own mother. Later that evening, after Ethan left, I sat alone in the living room thinking about forgiveness. People misunderstand forgiveness terribly. Forgiveness does not erase damage. It simply means you stop letting damage poison every remaining part of your life. And strangely, I no longer felt consumed by anger. Sadness, yes. Disappointment, absolutely. But not hatred. Because hatred keeps you emotionally chained to the people who hurt you. I was too old and too tired for chains anymore. Then one night near the end of April, Megan called again. This time her voice sounded small and frightened. Grandma, yes, sweetheart, Dad's sleeping in his office. My chest tightened. He says he doesn't deserve home anymore. I closed my eyes immediately, because that sentence told me life had finally taught Ethan the lesson no mother ever wants her child to learn this way. The cruelest thing about betraying someone who truly loves you is eventually realizing no one else will ever love you quite the same again. The night Ethan came to my house in the rain, I knew before opening the door that something inside him had finally broken completely. Not pride, not ego, illusion. Outside thunder rolled softly across the Ohio sky, while cold rain hammered against the porch roof. I had just finished making tea when the doorbell rang around 11:30. At first I thought maybe something had happened to Megan. My heart immediately raced as I hurried to the door. Then I opened it and saw my son standing there soaked to the bone. For a second, neither of us spoke. Ethan looked exhausted in a way that went far beyond lack of sleep. His shoulders sagged beneath his wet jacket, and his eyes looked hollow, like someone who had spent months losing pieces of himself, one realization at a time. Mom, he whispered. That single word carried more pain than all our arguments combined. I stepped aside immediately. Come in before you freeze. He walked inside slowly, while rainwater dripped onto the hardwood floor. I handed him one of Richard's old towels without thinking. The sight of Ethan holding his father's towel nearly made me cry instantly. Because suddenly, he didn't look 42 years old anymore. He looked 11, lost, ashamed, trying not to fall apart in front of me. I made tea while Ethan sat silently at the kitchen table, staring down at his trembling hands. The same kitchen, the same table, the same child I once helped through nightmares and heartbreak and grief after Richard died. Only now the nightmare was himself. After several minutes, he finally spoke. Vanessa moved out completely today. I stayed quiet. The divorce lawyer says the house will probably have to be sold. Again, I said nothing. Not out of cruelty, Because consequences sound different when you stop rescuing people from hearing them fully. Ethan laughed once weakly. She says I ruined her life. The irony nearly hurt. He looked around the kitchen slowly. You know what's strange? He whispered. What? She was right about one thing. I frowned slightly. I really didn't know how much you were doing for me. That sentence settled heavily between us. For years, I believed protecting Ethan silently was love. Now I wondered if silence had also protected him from gratitude, accountability, and maturity. I should have let you struggle more, I admitted quietly before I could stop myself. Ethan looked startled. No. Yes? I sat down slowly across from him. Every time life got hard, I stepped in, before you even realized danger existed. I looked down at my tea. And eventually, you started believing stability belonged to you naturally. Ethan's eyes filled immediately. Don't blame yourself for what I did. I looked at him carefully then, and for the first time in months, I heard responsibility in his voice instead of defensiveness. No excuses, no Vanessa, no confusion, just truth. I betrayed you, he whispered. The honesty of it almost hurt worse than denial. Outside thunder rumbled softly again, while the old kitchen clock ticked between us. Then Ethan suddenly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something folded carefully in plastic, a wrinkled $20 bill. My breath caught instantly. The grocery money, I whispered. He nodded slowly. I hadn't seen that bill in decades. The little note from his childhood had faded badly over the years, but I still recognized his messy handwriting. For groceries. Love you, Mom. Ethan swallowed hard. I found it in your dresser when I was helping organize some papers after Christmas. His voice cracked. You kept it all these years. Of course I did. Tears slipped down his face openly now, and suddenly I understood the real reason he came that night. Not for money, not for rescue, for absolution. But absolution is complicated, because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. I became someone Dad would have hated, Ethan whispered. No, I said softly. You became someone who stopped listening to his conscience. He looked up at me painfully. That's worse. Silence filled the kitchen again. Then Ethan finally said the words I think he had been carrying for months. How do I live with what I said to you? I stared at him for a long time before answering. You don't erase it. His face crumpled slightly. You carry it. That's the truth about certain mistakes. Some wounds never fully disappear. They become part of who you are afterward. But I continued gently carrying guilt, and learning from guilt are different things. Ethan lowered his eyes. I don't expect things to go back to normal. Good. Because they couldn't. Not fully. Trust rebuilt after betrayal always grows differently than before. More careful, more fragile, more honest. Then Ethan surprised me. I don't want your money anymore. The sentence came quickly, firmly, almost desperately. I mean it, he added. I need to figure out who I actually am without everybody saving me. I felt something loosen quietly inside my chest hearing that, because for the first time in a very long while, my son sounded like a man instead of a frightened boy hiding behind someone else's influence. Still, I remained careful. Growth takes time. One emotional night doesn't erase years of damage. I'll always love you, I said softly. But things will be different now. Ethan nodded immediately. I know. No more access to my finances. I understand. No more discussions about my competency or independence. His face twisted with shame again. Never again. And Ethan, I paused carefully. If you ever allow another person to convince you I'm a burden instead of your mother, his eyes immediately filled. I won't. I believed he meant it. But trust doesn't return instantly just because someone cries sincerely. That's another painful truth about betrayal. Love may survive quickly. Trust rarely does. A few days later, Ethan began attending counseling voluntarily, not because courts required it, because he finally realized how easily He had surrendered his judgment to manipulation. He also downsized his business significantly and sold several expensive things voluntarily, including the truck he once proudly showed me after his company first succeeded. One afternoon, while helping him sort old paperwork, I asked quietly, "Do you hate Vanessa?" He surprised me by answering immediately, "No." I looked at him carefully. "She manipulated you. I know." He sighed heavily. "But I let myself believe things because they benefited me too." That answer told me more about Ethan's growth than any apology ever could. Real maturity begins when people stop portraying themselves as innocent victims in stories where they also caused harm. Meanwhile, Megan started visiting my house regularly again. Slowly, warmth returned in careful little pieces: movie nights, cookies, homework at the kitchen table. One evening, Megan looked up suddenly while drawing and asked Grandma, "Are you and Dad okay?" Now children ask the hardest questions with the simplest words. I thought carefully before answering. "We're healing." She nodded thoughtfully, like that answer somehow made perfect sense. Maybe it did. Healing isn't returning to the old version of a relationship. It's building a more honest one from the ruins. Late one evening, near the end of spring, Ethan and I sat on the porch watching rain roll across the neighborhood. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, almost like a confession, he said, "When Dad died, I was so scared of losing you too that I think part of me spent years pretending you'd always be there no matter how badly I acted." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes, because that was probably true, and maybe I carried responsibility for that illusion too. Parents often love their children so unconditionally that the children stop understanding love can still be wounded. I reached over slowly and covered Ethan's hand with mine, not because everything was fixed, not because the pain vanished, but because despite everything, he was still my son. And sometimes healing begins not with forgetting the worst moment, but with finally choosing not to let it become the final one. The next Christmas arrived quietly. No courtroom drama, no screaming arguments, no legal documents spread across a coffee table, just snow. Soft Ohio snow drifting across the neighborhood while golden light glowed from the windows of my house. For the first time in many years, I decorated exactly the way I wanted to. Not for appearances, not to hold a family together by force, not to create the illusion of peace while tension rotted underneath everything. Real peace feels different, quieter, gentler, honest. I wrapped garland around the staircase Richard built with his own hands 40 years earlier. I baked cinnamon bread with Megan while old jazz records played softly in the kitchen. I even laughed more that December than I had in years. Healing surprised me that way. It didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived through small moments where fear slowly stopped controlling the atmosphere of my life. Over the previous year, many things changed, some painfully, some beautifully. Vanessa finalized the divorce during late summer. After the financial realities became impossible to ignore, the marriage collapsed completely. She moved to Chicago for a corporate event position and rarely contacted Ethan except regarding Megan. Oddly enough, I no longer hated her. I pitied her. Because people who build their lives around control eventually discover control cannot create love, only fear. And fear always leaves eventually. Ethan, meanwhile, rebuilt his life slowly, honestly. For the first time since becoming an adult, he learned how to survive without invisible rescue. He downsized the business dramatically and began taking smaller renovation projects instead of chasing prestige contracts and appearances. He rented a modest townhouse instead of trying to maintain the oversized home Vanessa once insisted defined success. And little by little, my son began looking like himself again. Not the younger version, a wiser one, a sadder one too, perhaps, but real. Therapy changed him more than I expected. One afternoon during the fall, he admitted something quietly while helping me rake leaves. I spent years believing strength meant controlling situations before they fell apart. I looked over at him, What do you think strength is now? He pushed leaves slowly into a pile before answering. Being honest enough to admit when you're wrong before you destroy people. That answer stayed with me, because growth often sounds simple after suffering teaches it. Megan changed too. Children always do after witnessing family fractures. For a while, she became quieter, more cautious around conflict. But over time, warmth returned to her naturally. She spent weekends at my house, baking cookies, planting flowers, and listening to old stories about Richard. One evening, while we decorated the Christmas tree together, she held up one of Richard's old firefighter ornaments carefully. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Grandpa would still love Dad after everything? The question nearly broke my heart, because children desperately want love to survive mistakes. I knelt beside her carefully. Yes, I said softly. But I think Grandpa would also expect your dad to learn from those mistakes. Megan thought about that seriously, then nodded. Children understand truth more deeply than adults realize. By December, my house no longer felt haunted by betrayal. It felt alive again, partly because I stopped living in fear, and partly because I finally understood something important. Protecting your boundaries is not cruelty, it's self-respect. For too many years, I believed love required endless sacrifice without limits. But unconditional love without boundaries eventually becomes permission for mistreatment. I refuse to live that way anymore. That Christmas Eve, I hosted dinner again for the first time since everything happened. A smaller dinner, a quieter one. Linda came over carrying pies and too much wine. Megan helped me set the table while laughing loudly about a school play disaster. Soft music played in the background while snow drifted outside, exactly like the year before. But the atmosphere felt completely different now. No manipulation, no hidden agendas, no performance, just honesty. Around 6:30, there was a knock at the door. Ethan. For a second, seeing him standing there holding a small wrapped gift brought back painful memories from the previous Christmas. The shouting, the humiliation, those terrible words. You're not family anymore. Some scars never disappear entirely, but scars and open wounds are different things. Merry Christmas, Mom Ethan said quietly. He looked nervous, not entitled, not defensive, simply grateful to be invited. Merry Christmas, I replied softly. When he stepped inside, Megan ran straight into his arms. And watching my son hold his daughter with tears quietly filling his eyes reminded me how close all of us came to losing each other permanently. Dinner that night wasn't perfect. Healing families rarely are. There were awkward silences sometimes, moments where old pain flickered briefly beneath the surface. But there was honesty too. And honesty creates peace. Perfection never can. At one point during dessert, Ethan looked around the table quietly, then at me. I still think about Christmas last year every single day, he admitted softly. The room became silent immediately. Linda glanced down respectfully, while Megan focused carefully on her plate. I met Ethan's eyes calmly. I know. He swallowed hard. I don't expect forgiveness to erase it. It doesn't, I replied gently. Truth matters, especially truthful healing. Then I added something else. But I don't want the worst thing you ever did to become the only thing that defines you either. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Because redemption only matters when people fully understand what they're being redeemed from. Later that evening, after dinner ended and Megan fell asleep upstairs beside the Christmas tree lights, Ethan and I sat quietly in the living room. The same living room where Richard and I once stayed awake, wrapping presents after Ethan went to bed. Life circles strangely sometimes. Ethan stared at the fireplace for a long time before speaking. Did you ever regret helping me all those years? The question surprised me. I thought carefully before answering. No. He looked stunned, even after everything. Yes, I said softly, because loving you was never the mistake. Tears slid silently down his face. The mistake, I continued gently, was believing love meant abandoning myself completely. He nodded slowly, and I think that was the moment Ethan finally understood the full lesson life had tried teaching both of us. Love should never require someone to surrender dignity in exchange for belonging. Not mothers, not children, not anyone. A few weeks later, Susan Keller finalized the charitable foundation Richard and I had quietly discussed years earlier, but never completed. The Griffin Family Foundation for Elder Advocacy. Most of my estate would eventually support older adults facing financial exploitation, emotional coercion, and forced isolation. When Ethan read the documents, he surprised me again. I'm glad, he said quietly. You are? He nodded. Maybe if more people understood how manipulation actually works inside families, fewer people would become what I became. That sentence stayed with me long afterward, because evil rarely begins dramatically. Sometimes it begins through tiny compromises, tiny silences, tiny selfish decisions people justify until they no longer recognize themselves. And maybe that's why I finally decided to tell this story. Not because betrayal destroyed my family, but because truth, accountability, and boundaries eventually gave us a chance to rebuild it honestly. Different, scarred, imperfect, but honest. And at my age, I've learned honest love is worth far more than comfortable illusions ever were. After everything that happened, I learned a painful truth that many women my age understand far too well. Sometimes the people who love you can also become the people who slowly stop seeing your humanity. For years, I believed sacrifice alone could hold a family together. I thought if I gave enough, forgave enough, stayed patient enough, eventually love would protect itself. But love without boundaries becomes dangerous. When you spend your entire life rescuing others while ignoring your own pain, people can begin mistaking your kindness for weakness and your silence for permission. What happened between Ethan and me didn't begin with one cruel sentence at Christmas dinner. It began much earlier in all the moments where manipulation went unchallenged, where discomfort was ignored to keep the peace, and where guilt became stronger than self-respect. But I also learned something hopeful. It is never too late to reclaim your voice, never too late to protect your dignity, never too late to stop apologizing for needing respect from the people closest to you. And for anyone listening who has been made to feel invisible because of age loneliness or family pressure, please hear me. Clearly, growing older does not make your life less valuable. Your wisdom matters. Your boundaries matter. Your independence matters. Most importantly, love should never require you to disappear in order to keep someone else comfortable. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced betrayal, manipulation, or healing inside your own family? What would you have done in my place? Share your thoughts and your story in the comments below. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Sometimes the stories we share remind someone else that they are stronger and less alone than they thought.